Hello and welcome to the fourth and final workshop in the AusSTS Online Series. My name is Jennifer Macdonald and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with Charles Darwin University and CSIRO. To begin this session, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of all the places that you're listening from. This session is called Disruption, Opportunity and Rearranging STS Research and will revolve around research interrupted in the time of COVID-19, exploring our responses to interrupted travel plans and destabilised institutional supports, which has made it hard to stay focused and on track. The way that scholarship participates in emerging worlds has also been challenged, changing capacities for communication, verification and conduct of methods, and reconfiguring what it means to be there within your research. This workshop will explore some of those challenges, the first half of which I will be helping to chair, and which is being live streamed to you on YouTube. We have the ever fabulous Tao Fan, research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute and convener of the Australasian STS Grad Network, moderating the YouTube live chat. We're keen to hear and answer your questions, which you can either put on the YouTube chat or post them to us on Twitter using the hashtag AusSTS2020. I've worked with my colleagues in Darwin, Michaela Spencer and Kirsty Howey, to organise this event. Michaela is a postdoctoral fellow with the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University, and Kirsty is just about to submit her PhD with Sydney University. In the first half of our workshop, we're so lucky to have Andrea Ballestero and Tess joining us. Andrea is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rice University and Director of the Ethnography Studio. Tess is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Sydney. We talked yesterday about how they'd like to be introduced, and they requested this should happen through introducing their dogs. So Tess has a very lovely, fluffy dog called Miss Molly Moo. That's her whole name. Andrea's pup's name is Frihol. Sorry if I've got the pronunciation wrong, and my better dog half is called Maru. So how this session will run is that Andrea will give a talk for the first 20 to 25 minutes, after which she'll be joined by Tess as discussant and myself to facilitate questions from the audience. Andrea's talk is titled Interruption, Pause, Reorientation, where she'll think about how we conceptualize our research projects, particularly ethnographic ones, in our current context, thinking about an epistemic orientation to what it means to do research in our given circumstances. In around 35 to 40 minutes from now, Zoom workshop participants, you know who you are, will meet to talk more about challenges and opportunities that have arisen from our disrupted research. Andrea and Tess will be joined by Michaela and Kirsty to facilitate that workshop. So Andrea, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's really wonderful to see all of you, and for all of the people that are joining through Facebook. I'm really excited to be in conversation. And I wanted, of course, to first start by thanking all of you for the incredible work that you've been doing and the labor that you've been putting into keeping our communities going, a kind of labor that, of course, as we all know well, often goes unacknowledged, but which is fundamental for the work that we do in academia, but well beyond. So Kirsty, Jennifer, Michaela, and Thao, thank you so much for everything that you've been doing. At the same time, the institutions that support the work of the network, our own institutions, just the capacity that we have at the moment to keep the spaces within those institutions that are generated going, like the Science and Society Network at Deakin, and of course, the Charles Darwin University and all of the amazing work happening there. And I guess we'll see you in July 2021 over there. So keep that in mind. So what I wanted to do today was not so much give a talk on a particular kind of research method, but more share my reflections on how this whole life-changing experience that we've been having is reshaping our research. And my reflections grow out of two strands of events, if you will. On the one hand, they were originally inspired by a sister effort that was led by fellow anthropologist and STS scholar Rachel Douglas-Jones at ITU Copenhagen, where she also led an amazing team with a workshop that was creating opportunities for students to think about how to do with the world as we see it today. And the other stream are my own students, and particularly 3 of them with whom we were thinking about how to share some of the tactics that they have developed and the conversations that we've been having with a bigger audience. So my thoughts combine both of those conversations in a way. So at the moment that I started thinking about these questions, of course, I'm based here in the United States, and it was in the middle of a series of layers of things that were happening. Of course, the pandemic, but also the recent killing of George Floyd and the massive protests still ongoing against police brutality and the systemic racism in the United States, led by movements like Black Lives Matter. And so in the middle of all of that, and as those events continued in time, we found ourselves, and we as a collective of researchers, with immediate responsibilities for our research, trying to make sense of its significance, of its value, and of its prospects in those conditions. And of course, these questions, or the answers to these questions, take different meanings depending on your structural and personal conditions. So the way my research as a professor in a US university was interrupted is very different to the way in which students work, or a postdoc's work, or a precarious academics is. So I wanted to start thinking, putting those things on the table and offering my thoughts as one of the possible strands in these kinds of reflections. The other thing is that in previous installments of this series of workshops, you've had really generative and amazing conversations about, on the one hand, COVID itself and the pandemic and the notion of the pandemic, as well as concrete and practical reflections around the kinds of digital habits, skills, or practices that you can draw upon as you adjust your research, your future research, or your ongoing research to the current conditions. And I'm really orienting all of my comments to students and to scholars that are starting in this path, although in a way we're all starting all the time, but there's a certain chronology that characterizes some people as being at the beginning. So what I want to do today is not necessarily focus on the pandemic per se as a phenomenon, and not necessarily focus on methods specifically, but think a little bit more about what interruption as a condition can do to one's worldly experience. Or to put it differently, how can we conceptualize the kind of interruptions that have happened in relation to our research projects? So what to make of them? And maybe have that conversation without rushing too fast or too quickly into the methods to solve the problems that we might be having. So maybe expanding a little bit the current moment. So as Jennifer mentioned, I had organized my talk around 3 notions: the notion of interruption, pause, and reorientation. So in learning from the digital, but also sort of exemplifying or putting a little bit of a show for you, I sort of produced these kinds of things. So just to remind the ways in which the digital is always, interrupted by these kind of analogic resources that we're using, when the immediacy and the quick and the velocity of the digital is not necessarily something that we want to work with. So how do we think with interruption? In a way that makes us recognize the possibilities that emerge when we think or try to pause, right? Instead of thinking of the interruption as something that is inherently disruptive in a destructive kind of way. So in each of these forms, interruption pushes us to consider what is at stake in our research, both as a series of techniques or practices for reflection, but also in terms of the political stakes of our knowledge. And here what I'm referring to is something that we can think of as the significance and ethical import of the work that we are doing in this particular moment in history. Why is it that we are doing the research that we are doing now? And how are those reasons reflected in the questions that we ask and in the orientations, techniques, tactics, methods that we use to answer those questions? And I want to mention here that I'm not implying with this that we all need to be doing COVID research at the moment. Although I am saying that living in a COVID world needs to be acknowledged. And so the question is, how do we do that if we're not going to turn all of our projects into COVID projects? So let's think about pause for a moment. In our academic settings, one of the first things that happened when the pandemic hit, that it created this pause. We were told by our respective institutions and healthcare officials that we needed to halt activities. And so a pause of sorts ensued in relation to this particular dimension of our lives. This was a kind of suspension that had unexpected effects. So beyond the emotional and the personal toll, that pause pushed to us a series of questions about our work. One that was very apparent to me was related to time. So the pandemic made explicit, and hence it denaturalized, the temporality of our work. It forced us to stop. And that pause had the effect of revealing the very strong assumption that we were all operating on. And that was that research is something like a linear river, flowing endlessly, always with a current, always with a thrust, moving constantly. And so that forward-looking temporality of our work was produced by cycles of different sorts. Such as going to class on a weekly basis, adding more interviews to our schedules, increasing the number of meetings attended, the numbers of interviews or sites at which we're conducting research. But not only did we expect those things to arrive, we also presumed that they would occur with a certain rhythm. So we would continue going to class on a weekly basis, we would continue setting preliminary interviews in the next 10 days, 15 days, we would finish our grant proposal by the month of May or August. So for a moment, the pandemic put a hold on that. And that pause in our labor, in that part of the labor that we performed in our lives, weakened the connections between time, administrative checkpoints, and outcomes. And it made really explicit the familiarity with which before the pandemic, we structured our daily lives around hyper-efficient means-ends relations, if we want to call them that way. And these relations privileged really heavily the instrumental character of our daily work. And so with coronavirus, seemingly, things were stopped, those things. And that taken for granted instrumental role broke. And that created all sorts of problems for different people in different ways. I find it interesting that such breaking of our professional temporality and the associated debilitation of instrumental relations are not unique to the pandemic condition, but we kind of forgot about that. So those of us who conduct fieldwork are used to moments when there is no constant flow of events. If anything, many of us feel that fieldwork is made up of accelerations of time, so periods that seem to be filled with activity, and decelerations, when it seems that all we are doing is keeping our bodies going and our institutions or organizations alive, rather than accomplishing interviews or acquiring transformative insights. And yet when the pandemic hit, it was as if something completely unexpected and unfamiliar had occurred. And this was particularly so during the first few weeks. So what I make of this and what I want to suggest is that for those of us that were at our universities in the middle of the semester when the pandemic hit, what it did was to put us in the midst of the kinds of experiences and situations that we encounter when conducting fieldwork. in that place that we tend to call, quote unquote, the world, the things that happen outside the university. So even if we first thought that the pandemic was like a switch that turned off our research lives, it was far from that. Instead, it brought into our daily lives the conditions that we experience while doing fieldwork. In other words, what the pandemic pause did was remind us of what we knew from our fieldwork, that our research lives are always determined by intensities, by different degrees of activity, full of times when things seem to be suspended. And yet, even when all of those things are happening, you're still considering yourself in fieldwork modality. So this breaking of means-ends relation of what was happening in particular institutions, the efficiency with which we supposed we were going to accomplish things, can be quite painful. So I don't want to ignore that dimension. It has material consequences that are asymmetric. For many of you, it creates challenges in terms of funding, in uncertainties in terms of job prospects, difficulties in handling all of our keen obligations at the same time. So this is not to romanticize the pandemic pause in any kind of way. But what I want to acknowledge is that it made explicit a certain underlying assumption about how the world works, always in flux, always a sequence of instrumental actions. And that, I want to suggest, made us reconsider what fieldwork as a moment in the research process does to our methodologies and to our subjectivities. So the pause the pandemic imposed laid bare those different ontological assumptions and how differentiated spatially and temporally they were. One set of assumptions operating at the university or in a regular schedule, a different set of assumptions operating in what we might call field research. After that initial shock, or within that pause that I find a really generative one to think carefully about, interruption is also a form to incite a certain kind of reorientation. And this is what I'm going to turn to next. So after the pause, we found ourselves restarting or redefining our sense of direction, seeking ways to re-immerse ourselves or to regain our momentum while being in locations that were not matching the set of ontological assumptions that we had made about how the world operated in those locations, either within the institution, taking classes, finishing your research proposal, or doing fieldwork. So many of you are probably in that situation. Some of you still, I would imagine, having to reinvent and create a new trajectory that does not fit easily to the molds or models that we had available in the past. Those models that were just sitting there, waiting to be activated. So, and by those models, I mean, we knew that we were going to do participant observation for field research. We just had to activate that modality. We knew we were going to conduct surveys. We needed to just activate that model, and so on and so forth. And so at this moment of reorientation, which I find to be a really exciting intellectually moment, there's a number of tactics or options that one could follow, and I want to just share with you a couple that come to mind. So one tactic is to immerse yourself in the question of method. To ask yourself and to identify the methods that will allow you to find ways to approximate the things that we used to do through alternative means. So that strand is almost to replicate what was and try to translate it into a different medium to get as close as you can to what was. So you can conduct interviews over the internet, for instance. So you can attend meetings via Zoom. We can have conversations like this one. You can do work in social networks, etc. And so to one extent or another, we're all doing this in some way. However, there's something else that I think is really exciting to think with. And the second option is to rethink what methods and questions might look like and what dominant forms of engagement you might want to stay close to or move away from. So instead of trying to be there through the internet, yes, so if you can't be physically, you try to be there through the internet, what other things can we do? What other ways of asking questions and orienting our work could we explore together as a community? So not replicating the individualistic, I'm going to figure out what the answer is to this condition, but what kinds of inquiries can we organize as collectives to figure out what does it mean to do research in the conditions that we're living in at the moment. So I want to speculate about a couple of options for what those other alternatives could be. So what forms of reorientation can we experiment with to open ourselves to our current times instead of closing ourselves to those times to try to replicate what was there before? So for all of you who are designing your projects or redesigning them or even resuscitating them, let me put two possibilities on the table. One possibility is thematic and the other is practical. So one thematic question that immediately emerged to me, and I thought that the pandemic brought into sharp relief, was the question of systemic issues. For instance, systemic inequalities or systemic racism that undergirds our society in Denmark, in the United States, in Australia, or in Brazil, for instance. So the pandemic threw on our face the always tricky to chart relation between the aggregate and the specificities of our research. One of the cues that I take from a particular moment in history is to be much more explicit about the ways in which we can think about the systemic while remaining committed to the ethnographic or the situated fieldwork, to the specifics and the specificities of people and places and practices that we study. So there's a number of ways in which one can go about it. In my own research, I have done this by focusing my attention on what I call techno-legal devices, so instruments that people use to shape systemic logics, but which can be traced to very specific places, homes, desks, daily tasks. Thus, instead of thinking of that a project is determined by being in a particular place, thus getting away from the tendency that we often have to put a lot of trust into place and into intimacy, as if it was not, as if place and intimacy were not forms of being that also excluded certain kinds of things. We can adjust our design, our project design or research design, to think about the mechanisms or devices, if you want to call them, through which worlds are brought into being, in a way that the systemic and the specific are brought into relief. So this can happen in all sorts of projects and in very different kinds of ways. You can think about the work that a person does, but that also means you can also orient your work to do field work, say, in the history of ideas, or in the basic assumptions that technical fields make, or in the orienting principles of religious organizations, or with the challenges of some of the participants in the workshop were mentioning, of interviewing children when we try to do that online. So what are the systemic or aggregate questions that become relevant to understand those very place-specific points of entry, collaborators, communities with which we are familiar in our situated fieldwork-based research? But more broadly, the issue here is that the decisions about what objects of analysis we begin from need to be reconsidered and can lead you to different scales of inquiry and to different temporal moments as well. So what would fieldwork look like if it asked the questions about systemic logics? What forms of worldly evidence would you go after? What kinds of data would need to be created or invented? So this would be taking to heart the basic STS insight that facts and data are not out there waiting to be found by a 21st century explorer, but really to bring to heart this insight that is one of the most powerful insights of our field, and pose the question, how do I create the data that I need for the questions that are the questions that make sense at this particular moment in history? So this kind of orientation creates an amazing opportunity, I think, to think creatively about the data we want to produce, rather than just presuming that co-presence, spending time with another person, will automatically yield insights. So this is an opportunity to denaturalize that assumption. STS and anthropology are full of resources to keep this sensibility alive and to explore possibilities to do so. So if in ethnographic work, for example, data is collectively produced between the ethnographer and her interlocutors, what kinds of relationships can be fostered to generate unconventional ethnographic materials at this moment in time? And really importantly, how does this shift make us think about the ethics of ethnographic or field research when our interlocutors, many of them, find themselves in situations that are very difficult to handle health-wise, family-wise, work-wise, economically, etc. So this is a moment when I want to argue the extractivist logics that undergird so much research come into question. So if normally you would think that your role is to collect information from your interlocutors about how they go about their lives, maybe the pandemic requires a more generative and reciprocal conceptualization of how that process unfolds. Our interlocutors become more active participants in our projects. Rapport and access begin to look very different as we depend more intensely on the willingness, the openness of our interlocutors to share their worlds now that the strains are have augmented for people all over the world. And here, one way to make sense of what I'm trying to say is maybe a little bit of a provocative formulation that I want to make. And I want to suggest or invite you to think about this shift as a way to return to, in a way, more conventional form of ethnography, a form of lively encounter that is less focused on interviewing and puts more emphasis on the participant observation part of things. And so this might be a little bit counterintuitive, but what I'm saying is that given the restrictions that we have at the moment, what makes sense is to do more participant observation. And I believe that the pandemic is an important window for us as a community of researchers to figure out what that might look like. So participant observation opens many possibilities to establish reciprocal relations. So what one should begin by asking, what are the concerns people have in pandemic conditions? What are the difficulties they are encountering in their work, in finding work, in daily banking needs, in filing unemployment claims, in keeping their products in the market, in using online technologies? And I'm not going to continue going, but there's all of our worlds are being upended in one way or another. So what is it that is unique to this moment in those worlds? And so what if instead of presuming that ethnographic fieldwork is about asking people how they are dealing with those issues, fieldwork returned to its older forms. But we did so through what might be unconventional means. And the suggestion here is not that we are going to change our research questions necessarily, although that might be the case, to fit the needs of our collaborators or interlocutors. It's not that we are all going to be doing participative action research or any of the models that exist out there for collaborations that are very intimate and deeply intertwined. Not all researchers do that, so I want to acknowledge that. So I'm not saying that we should move to that modality. What I'm saying is, if you're not going to do that kind of research, if you were not doing that kind of research before, what if we took it on ourselves to figure what are the tasks that people are encountering in current conditions in relation to our themes of research questions, and share the difficulties and sometimes dull acts that people have to undertake to keep their work, their ideas, and their daily routines going. So this is a question of rethinking what might we have to offer as researchers, and how that which we have to offer can be powerful, opening into more nuanced and textured answers to the questions that we pose as researchers. So how can our skills be mobilized to accomplish some of these daily actions that were originally depicted maybe as objects of investigation? This reorientation will remind us and will show us, I am convinced, that in a way, the world never paused, that the intensity and the shape of people's actions changed, that the world was never put on hold, nor was your creativity as researchers, and nor was your curiosity. And so let me give you 3 examples of how that creativity and how that adjustment happened. And those are going to be examples that come from what I've learned from 3 of my fantastic graduate students here at RISE. So one example, Yeimar Oyerson, who is a student that is designing her dissertation, was supposed to conduct preliminary fieldwork with dermatologist here in the United States. She's studying the way in which the Black skin figures in the education of dermatologists and its connection with questions of racism here in the United States. And she was supposed to do fieldwork at either a clinic or at a university where dermatologists were being trained. Of course, that could not happen. And instead, what she did was she participated in a series of conferences that she was supposed to attend, and used that setting to very pointedly reach to a broader set of possible interlocutors. So these were conferences where dermatological conferences happening here in the United States. And so the Zoom platform and the conference platform allowed her to redesign her tactics to reach out to the participants, that series of participants that she would have not been in touch with before. So that's one very initial one. The solution to the problem of the impossibility of conducting a conference became an opportunity for Yeimar to reach out to a group of interlocutors that maybe she would have not been in contact otherwise. The second student is Mel Ford, who is conducting fieldwork in Guatemala City. She's studying how architects become prominent conservation activists. She's thinking about ravines and their remaking as prominent features of the city in Guatemala. And in her case, fieldwork with local organizations stopped. And what she did was really amazing. She turned to the body of work that her interlocutors had produced in the past. She's working with architects, so she traced some of their theses or even some reports that these architects had written. And these documents were, had the pandemic not hit, would have figured in her work as background information to the fieldwork. But what she did was she turned these documents around, opened them up, and used them as a way to continue building the relationship that she had with the architects that she had been in conversation with. And in that way, completely new avenues of historical issues opened up for her to investigate. And I'm going to end with Katie Ulrich. and I know I'm going a little bit over time, so I'm going to be brief, who was working in Brazil with scientists investigating the new lives that sugarcane can lead as an alternative to petrochemical products. And she was working at a lab. And when the pandemic hit, the lab was shut down. What was really amazing is that what became evident and rose to the fore for Katie was all of the work that was necessary to shut down the lab, to make it stop working. And that had really important questions in terms of what productivity means and how people in that lab see the connection between their daily practices, their investigations, and the outcomes that they want to put out in the world. And so here in this case, the pandemic made explicit a set of questions and social processes that would have not been visible for her had it not hit, and had she not remained open to thinking about the way in which the pandemic changes the world and thus changes her questions. So to end, I just want to say that my call is a call to intensify rather than dilute our research practices. And so how that intensification looks is highly specific. And for that reason, I'm really glad that we're going to have some time in the workshop to talk about the specific projects and the concrete projects of the students. But overall, the idea is that we are entitled to intensifying and deepening our research practices in their own terms. That is to intensify our curiosities. And instead of trying to replicate what you thought your project would be by changing methods to approximate something that could have been, my invitation is to refigure your questions, to ask how can you approach them in this particular context. And to stick to your curiosities, to stick to the things that matter to you, and to open up your creativity to build new forms of inquiry. So rather than reproducing what was by approximating, this is an amazing time to refigure our possibilities, to refigure the worlds that we want to see take place. And we can do so collectively in spaces just like this workshop. So those were my reflections. Thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to our conversations.
Do you want me to speak straight away? So thank you so much, Andrea, for that set of really thoughtful and useful provocations. Because she was part of the introduction, this is Miss Molly Moo, who insists on being part of the workshop. But it's actually really to do with the fact that I sit in silence at the desk as I'm Zooming, and then randomly I start talking. And in her entire life, me starting to talk when there's no one else in the room, usually in pre-COVID times, meant I was talking to her, and she's constantly trying to work out, what am I actually wanting? So almost this is an inevitable part of the beginning of anything, when I have to sort of deal with her attempt to try and interpret what I want, when in fact I don't really want her on my lap at all. But there you go. Good girl. Okay, that was Miss Molly Moo. So Andrea, it was just really lovely to hear you talk on those issues and to expand on all the different things that you touched on. So some of my comments are more in the sense of, can you just give us a little bit more on? And to start on that, I'm really interested in this expansion and contraction of time that you made, you know, at the outset. These observations on what's going on temporally, how it impairs and liberates research, how it sort of aggravates productivity anxiety, and I guess a sense of precarity pushed together. And in some people's cases, that's been completely immobilizing. You know, that's been something that that there's certain sort of productive outputs, I don't know, forms of spending time when you're trying to work your way through COVID and prove your own utility, which is the onus on a lot of people here in Australia as academics are being slashed and burnt, to nonetheless do those things that don't require original thinking, because even though they seem to have more time, the time for original thought seems to have been smashed. So that's one of the, so there's a relationship between this, what's going on with time, what's going on all around us, this liberation, this impairment and affect. So that was one of the things I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you on. And in relationship to that and your call to regain momentum, even though we might no longer have our institutional or our epistemological props, our old habits, your call to take this pause and interruption and have it be generative, not demoralizing. I see that opening comments about time and your call at the end of as having a relationship, and I'd like you to expand on that.
Thank you. So I tell this story to my students. So if some of my students are watching, this is going to be a repeat. But I had a professor. So when I was in grad school doing my master's, I was new to the United States, and it took me a really long time to learn how to write in English, and I was having a really hard time. And I went to this professor, and I asked him, "How do you write?" And their answer was, "There's two ways in which you can write. One is as a proletariat. You show up every day, you have a time, you have a task to do, and you do it because you don't have an option. Another one is as a capitalist. You can have other people sit down, go ahead and do the labor of the everyday work, and then you can think like the supposedly big idea and take credit for it." And then they said, "How do you think I write?" "I write like a proletariat." So this is a tangential way to get to the question of what does it mean to think the original thought? Like how can we think about the original thought as something that happens also through the repetitive tasks of the everyday, and sort of defetishize a little bit what the original thought is. So that's one thing that I try to think about as I organize my work, as I work with students. So I think of what we do, of course, as a way of as an existential orientation, but I'm also very clear that what I do is a form of labor. And so not losing track of this, the part of what we do that is repetitive, that is predetermined, that is habitual, that is not the place where the original thought and the mind can wander, the mind body can wander into new spaces. Not all of the work that we do is that way. And so I would want to sort of revalue the work that we do when we're not thinking the original thought, because I think it's really powerful. Now, I understand that there's a way in which that work can be pushed to say, account for yourself and show that you are useful to society. And what is useful to society is predetermined by a certain group of people. So I'm not ignoring that fact. But in terms of the daily pressures and the daily difficulties that we face in fitting in society and institutions, in assessment methods, when we have this condition and we want to be pushing for more, I would say there's a kind of labor that we all have to do in fitting with assessment conditions, and that labor that labor builds some foundations. It creates some things that are that can allow us to create those spaces for thinking the original thought. I'm going to say it a third way, and then I'll shut up. Let's not create a dichotomy between the original thought and the thought that is repetitive and fitting in structure, in like strict structures. Let's maybe think about it in a more intertwined kind of way, because I think both work off of each other. Yeah.
I think that's gorgeous, because it also, I mean, apart from also being incredibly useful, a reminder that actually what I call much more crudely velcroing your butt to the chair and doing the work is also a means of actually generating all sorts of things. And I share your suspicion, although you were very kind about it, of even the term original thought. But it does relate to that attentiveness to what are the labours of it, you know, what are the techniques of it and the materials of it, relates to your other call in the paper, which I found really refreshing and interesting. This part where you have said, let's think about the durable inequalities that they have not gone away. You've called them systemic. That and how we might actually be helpful by tuning into what are the labours of the everyday being navigated by those with whom we actually otherwise would want to ally or be accomplices with, and then lend yourself to that. So it's a form of participant observation. It's a form of attentiveness to labours, attentiveness to mundanities, not looking for the spectacular or over fetishising something called original. So I can see that there's a relationship between those two things, which I find really useful, because I'm constantly, and more than ever at the moment, students, postgraduate students in particular, are presenting themselves to me with a major form of anxiety, and it comes in two forms. One is, what's the point of doing this PhD when all the academic jobs are, if we ever had a hope for them, we always knew it was going to be competitive, but now it's like a burnt field, and, you know, there is no incentive to be that thing. And the second one is, I do not want to be doing research which is extractive, or in the old days we used to call it appropriative, and that I want to do something which is of use. And I go blue in the face saying, that's the wrong way of posing the problem, that, you know, that you will come up with a miracle topic, you know, like the cancer cure thesis, that is going to be bottled up and of use. It's the practice of through it is how you are skilling yourself and making your skills available, and also how you are learning about what are the issues people are grappling with, and then offering yourself to those issues that will matter more than your cancer cure topic. So please don't go for the cancer cure topic, because chances are your idea of utility needs to be questioned. So, you know, I find myself in repetition mode, but I think your thing of, well, how about you, if that is your anxiety, use these techniques and these methods to actually probe that question ethnographically. So that's fantastic. I want to though point to the thing which you yourself said, this might sound like a bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, let's not just cleave to the idea that everything is solved through co-presence, or everything is learnt through co-presence. There are all these other modalities in which we can find out, learn, immerse, become aware of, replace, you know, embodied intimacy with other kinds of awareness. And then you said, but let me also put forward participant observation as a key technique going forward. So can you speak to what returning to older forms unconventionally, to use your phrase, might mean. You gave some examples, which I felt were also examples of, in fact, again, an old-fashioned technique of being alert to the chops and changes, the serendipities of the field anyway. You know, how you might be flung out of something to discover something else, or you face a stone wall and that stone wall diverts you into a new discovery. And that openness and flexibility is kind of like premium DNA requirement for any good field worker, it seems to me. So yeah, could you speak to that, you know, I guess a new old and an old new within what you're calling for?
Yeah, so I feel that at some point, conversations about participant observation got overshadowed by the question of place and people, right? So I have to be in a particular place among a certain group of people. In my case, I have to be in a regulatory agency amongst regulators. Or for the project that I'm working on, I have to be among hydrogeologists in this particular location. And so in training and in conversations with students, we often emphasized that, or at least I heard many students emphasizing that part, and less thinking about what are the, let's call them practices, but I even like more, what are the lively problems that people are going to be dealing in that space? What are the things that are going to be occupying their minds? And how is it that we can participate in those rather than participating in place and community? And so that it's almost like becoming more precise and more specific so that you can be more open-ended. Right? So understanding and thinking more carefully about what are the processes or the complications in life that your particular group of interlocutors are going to be dealing with, and thinking about the strands or the threads that go through those problems and using those as guides to push forward your participant observation, rather than presuming that mere presence and mere intimacy is going to give you or open the door to whatever question it is that you're asking. So I think about it in very specific terms. In terms of the project, let me tell you the project that I'm working on at the moment. What I'm working on is the ways in which spatial imaginaries of the underground are changing in Costa Rica, and how this is the result of of aquifers becoming more prominent public formations in public discourse. And this is happening after the state has made a lot of investments in research on aquifers. So I could say, you know, my project is about being in this particular region so that I can understand how the communities in those areas are dealing with the question of the underground. But that would be the being there will open the door kind of modality. What I'm thinking is, instead, what are the scientific models by which hydrogeologists are disseminating a different way of thinking about the underground that existed before in the area? And so figuring out what those models are, how is it that they are replicated? How is it that they are disseminated amongst different communities? How is it that the problem of inviting people to imagine inaccessible places differently is being solved by these people? Is the guide that I use to think about what are the things that I need to know? What are the histories that I need to ask about? What are the documents that I need to go read that have nothing to do with being there with them, right? So maybe a metaphor to think about it is, what are the threads that go through the problem that mobilizes you? What are the threads that go through the curiosity that is at the core of the projects that you're working on? And for each of those threads, figure out what are the histories, what are the artifacts, what are the poems, what are the social media posts, what are the media saying, what are the technical knowledge that makes the situation what it is. And then use those for your participant observation rather than being with a group of people in a place. Is that helpful in making it more concrete?
Does for me, but I am aware of the time and I've been hogging you. Jennifer's nodding.
Going to jump in and interrupt and conversation, and I just wish that it could keep going on. We have had some really, really good questions on the chat, but maybe we can take those into the workshop. And hopefully everyone that has got a question is able to come along to the workshop. If not, you can always post it on Twitter, because these two are very good at twittering away. So thank you so much. It's so wonderful, and I wish we could just keep going on and on. It's a shame to interrupt it, but as you say, maybe it's normal as well.
It's a great bridge. And in the interests of thinking about people's labour and attentiveness and velcroing seats to the chair, in between whiles, if you're not going on to our workshops, you're meant to do, I think it's 5 star jumps, at least 5 star jumps.
Good idea.
Thank you very much. This has been lovely, and thank you everybody who connected. Email me or get in touch through Twitter. I would love to hear what you're thinking.
Thanks, Andrea.
Bye.
Bye.